that. Now, I want to go to Reverend Victor Muruzi. What do you have to drop in this? Let's hear from you.
Right. Thank you very much. It's a good question, and thank you very much, Reverend Tim, for that contribution. Now, a few years ago, I think in the year 2017, I was invited to speak in a conference, and I was told to prepare a talk on hyper-Pentecostalism in Kenya. I originally come from Kenya, and we were addressing some critical issues in principles and practice of hyper-Pentecostalism in Kenya. And these are some of the issues that came up. And some of the things that we had to contend with were the emerging trends, and that's why it was actually called hyper-Pentecostalism. Things like chasing after miracles, the wisdom of man, false prophets and strange fires, adverse contextualization of the gospel, and all of that. But key, and what I was really focused on at that particular time, was the attempt by the Kenyan government to try and regulate the church in Kenya. It so happened that the Attorney General then had moved a bill wanting to exercise some strict measures on the church with a view to try and cut some excesses that had happened and to protect some gullible parishioners or congregants, I would call it so. Jesus told Pontius Pilate in the book of John, chapter 19, verse 11, that he would not have any authority if God had not given it to him. And my approach to this is that a biblically conceived doctrine of the church and the state is all about jurisdictional authority. And I don't want to become complex. My mind is legally trained and I can weave some of these things, but I just want to make it very simple. It recognizes that God has given one kind of authority to government and another kind of authority, I would say, to the church. And my approach to this is that neither should usurp the other. Just allow me to just bring some perspective to this. Now, nowhere does the Bible envision the marriage or the wedding of the church and the state as is characterized in the Western world, I would say, from around the 4th century to the American Revolution. And I may not be very good at quoting dispensations like I see Reverend Tim has done, but my little church history has taught me a little bit of what was then Christendom and Constantinian sentiment. And what happened in those days in the 4th century was that the emperor and the pope came together and started to rule together as Christians or as an empire or as a nation. That's the word, call it. And now since then, for like about 1,000 years, a full millennia, the biblical arguments for Christendom and the church, the state and the church coming together and ruling together were too heavily based on what I would call the Messianic and the Davidic covenants. Just allow me to underpin this, then I will give it back to you. Now, we find somewhere, I think it was within that time, when we have the Nicene Christians being brought up by an emperor who was called Theodosius, and he said, from today henceforth, Christianity is the state church. It's a state religion. Everybody within the Roman Empire will worship no other God. They abandoned their pagan worship and what have you. And Christianity became the only religion back then. And we know the history and how that came about. Now, later on, some issues started coming up. For example, we had one emperor who killed the Thessalonians. And then what happened? The Pope told him, you cannot have Holy Communion. He actually excommunicated him. And of course, there were repercussions after that. And later on, we find the Islamic movements coming in, and the church began to lose its influence. The Roman Empire was virtually killed by the Islamic invasion in the 7th century. What happened? The church died a natural death. Now, the argument brought about is this: as long as the church and the state were enemies, quote unquote, the church thrived, the church was persecuted, and in the midst of persecution, the church was able to advance the gospel. When the church and the state, so to speak, became bedmates, they went to sleep, and unfortunately, it lost its influence. So this is my approach to this. I believe that the church has a moral obligation and a spiritual obligation to keep the state and the government on its toes. I remember when Joe Biden, and I'm sorry to be mentioning some names on your show, when Joe Biden was a senator, I do remember that there was a time that actually a Catholic bishop refused to administer Holy Communion to him because of his active support for abortion. All right. And on the same token, I believe that the government should be put right by the church when it breaks laws, when it harms people, when it is, waxing strong on things like taxes, things like children, injustices, and all that kind of a thing. And I believe today what we need to do is for the church to be that beacon and light and salt in the world, not to be so much so bedmates with the state, if that makes sense. And in so doing, we are going to be a leading, I would say, a beacon and a lighthouse. And the church, the world, the state will come to us as a source of hope and a source of encouragement. So that is the way I normally approach it. But Reverend Sim said, yes, we can have dominion and authority in each and every field that God has put us into. And this is a great commission to make disciples of all nations.
Amazing. Thank you so much for that. That was